so it is fascinating. James. And he's now located here in Boulder. So Boulder, I saw, is quite an interesting and quite knowledgeable area of people talking about disaster management. Also, the other, Mrs. Tierney is also here. She wrote a book about it, so it's interesting. You got up to 30 minutes, I would say.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I don't go by James anymore. I go by Jaia. It's a nice Sanskrit name. It means success or victory. It's nice to see you, Vijay. It's nice to be here.
Good to see you, James.
So I'm going to talk to you about a particular flood. And maybe I should spend at least 2 minutes and tell you why I even am giving you this talk. So I run an organization called CSDMS, the Community Service Dynamic Modeling System. We coordinate about 500 institutions in 68 countries that deal with open source software, dealing on how we can model the Earth's surface and the oceans and its connection to the atmosphere. And I was, in my role as director, I was going around and I saw someone give a talk, and they were mapping the Earth's surface. They had this capability. They were a NASA center. They were at the Dartmouth College, and they called themselves the Dartmouth Flood Observatory. And I liked them so much that I hired them all to come here. And so the director had an office that was beside mine, and every day they had this capabilities where they would map the Earth's surface every day, twice a day actually, and I would go by his office and I'd say, well, where's the Earth flooding today? And he'd say, in this case, oh, the Indus is flooding. And I thought, oh, that's cool. And I was working on some satellite systems myself to try to see whether we could have better ways of detecting flooding other than what this group was doing, and whether we could have secondary information. And I knew they were a NASA center, and I knew they were working with the UN in various ways to provide their information for a UN disaster reduction. So there was sort of an interest in mine, but I'm not a disaster person. I sort of am more of an operator of communities. And so I knew very little about the Indus. I knew that it was a dirty river that drained the Himalayas, that I knew that it was in Pakistan, and that very little of the water that came down that river ever reached the ocean. And that was a high interest to me, that most of the water was consumed along the way. It wasn't operating as a natural river anymore. And there's this particular event in 2010 that was outstanding, and I'll tell you about that. We had great observational data, which is another reason why a modeler or modeling community would be very interested in it. We had 3-hour trim data. We had 1-hour rain gauge data from 93 stations. We were in communication with the government. And it was a monsoonal event that, I don't know how exceptional it was, but it was big. Pakistan and Indus had bigger ones. So it wasn't going to be super outstanding, but it was outstanding in that I thought, well, this is interesting to see. And if you looked at where the flooding was in this neck of the woods, right in this area here, that's where the principal rainfall was coming down. And by the way, there was flooding there, and it was interesting, and that would be the typical kind of very fast response you'd want. Something was happening, things were happening, and you needed to get information to those on the ground that could do something about that. Get people out of the way, warn people, all of that Gerhard was talking about. Thank you. And if we can go back. So in here, this whole Sin province, all down through here, that's what flooded. They didn't get any rain, but they flooded. So that's the story. The story is that where the rain happens isn't necessarily where the floods happen. Now, part of the problem that is in most of the rivers of the world today, that they don't operate naturally. We have artificial rivers. And so in the historical past, you would have something called avulsions, where due to high water, you may get an overtopping of the natural levee banks, and you would get a breakout. And that breakout would be this avulsion, this new channel. And the channel may or may not be permanent, or may have just have happened. And if you looked at the historical maps of the Indus that the British mapped nicely in the 19th century, lots of avulsions. But if you look at today, the river is totally cut off from the floodplain by these stop banks, these banks that don't allow the water to escape, in an effort to protect people and infrastructure. And you have all these canals. In fact, the canals are outstanding, over 30,000 canals. In fact, the Indus turns out to be the largest engineering system in the world. And it was a phenomenal area for me to use my satellite approaches that were being developed. And so, if you don't mind, I'm going to show you a bit of a movie. Each image is a flood. Let's see if I can keep up. And you can see the flood happening here and going down the river channel, but then there was a break here. And while this flood was still being constrained by the stop banks, this break here allowed the water to penetrate. And we were working in providing this information to the right people for disaster reduction. There were towns and cities that were being flooded. We needed to find out where they were, which rivers and railroad lines were being cut off. While the flood down here was still going on, this was a slowly developing disaster. In fact, the flood here had already stopped, and this 357-kilometer length was this disaster that was being unfolding. And it took a month and a half. It was a very slowly evolving disaster. And we were seeing this from space. I'd go in every day and I'd see where the flood was. We were doing calculations. How fast was it going? The water in the main channel system was going at a typical clip in a river system that size, more than 2 meters per second, where this was, this all through here, that was traveling at about 0.3 meters per second, which is about how fast I walk. So you can outwalk that flood. And so we put a lot of time and effort to do this post-mortem. What happened? Why did it happen? Could we have done anything differently? So this Dartmouth Flood Observatory, they have been collecting information on floods because that's sort of what they're supposed to do. And this was event number 3696. So this was one in a series of events that they'd been looking at since the 90s, 2000s. And it flooded an enormous land surface. It took out 7,500 villages and 135 towns and cities. Many of the hospitals that would have received these injured people were themselves wiped out. Lots of the bridges, roads, railroads. There were thousands of deaths, 10 million people displaced. It ranked only the 84th of 3,784 global floods, but it was enormous. Pakistan's still recovering from that flood in 2010. It cost them $43 billion. It was the worst flood in their history. And yet, in terms of volume of water, it wasn't very exceptional at all. The thing about this flood was it shouldn't have happened. There were a lot of debates in the scientific community about putting in a monsoonal warning system, but none of that would have solved this problem. Part of the problem was these largest engineering structures in the world, this infrastructure of diversion, barrages, canals. So a barrage is this semi-dam that can be implemented to allow water to flow down into canal systems. That's a barrage. The problem was it slows down the river flow, the natural river flow and the flooding flow, and it puts a lot of the sediment behind the barrage. So that lifts the river channel high. So if you're not putting the levees higher all the time, you're having a decrease in the water board. That's a problem. And so if you look at this picture, there's a blow-up of one of these barrages near Sikkur, this city that's on the banks of the Indus. Here's what it was happening. This is not at the highest flood event, but you can see that, this is a big deal for that city. The city becomes important. And the reason the city becomes important is that this slowly evolving flood that was coming their way, they themselves in the city were not convinced their infrastructure could keep up with what was coming their way. So they made a big fuss and said, you must do something. Well, the equivalent of the Army Corps of Engineers in Pakistan, they wanted to open it up here to allow the water to flow down the Nara Canal and into this zone here. It would have been, they don't have a spillway. They should have had spillways along this river, but they didn't. That would have been their version of a spillway. Still, it would have caused damage downstream, but you would not have had the thousands of deaths, the 10 million people displaced. You would not have had that. And so you had most of the water still was constrained in the main channel. You can see here. But then when this opened up here, it just followed the natural path and doing damage along the way. And then again, near the delta itself, you had another avulsion. And unfortunately, there weren't so many people in the way of that one. So, as some of you know, I was chair of the International Geosphere Biosphere Program. Part of our mandate was to provide information to the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. And because of climate warming, there's an intensification of the hydrological cycle. Wet areas are going to get wetter, dry areas are going to get drier. And so we would be looking at this set of diagrams that the Dartmouth Flood Observatory had been putting out, showing that the number of floods, whether they be really big floods or even intermediate floods, they were increasing. Now, to us, our initial interpretation would have been that this is climate change. But as I got into their data, I started finding out that many of the floods were because of engineering failure. And therefore, I couldn't take this figure and say, oh, it's an example in support of intensification of the hydrological cycle. In fact, this one in the Chao Phraya River in Thailand, there was another monsoon that hit a dam that had too much water. The dam operator got scared. They released the water too fast, and that wiped out all of the areas in between. In red were flooded Bangkok's down by the coast, another big disaster only 1 year after the Indus one. And the more you look, you will find this out all over the world. Engineering failures. So if you're into system science, please keep that in mind. And here's another thing that we need to worry about is that our river systems, because they don't operate like river systems, they run like pipes. You have something like 108 cubic kilometers of water going into the Indus at this stage. You use most of it until less than half gets to the ocean. And that was in 2003. But in fact, today it's only 15 cubic kilometers. So very little of the water gets to the ocean. It's all being consumed. And in fact, if you look at all these red dots, these are the major rivers of the world where very little water gets to the ocean anymore. And it has a lot of problems because of that. Here's a satellite system in the Mississippi, and you can see the delta disappearing before your eyes. So each one of these images is a different year. So from 1984 to 2012, you see the Mississippi Delta disappearing, sea level rise, land sinking. I don't have the equivalent movie in the Indus, but what I do know from comparing the detailed maps that were prepared by the U.S. Army during World War II, 1944, and you will see that that shows up as yellow on this map. Underneath that is the present day, and you will see a whole bunch of giant tidal channels forming. You will see the tidal limit move inland. In fact, the disaster is now dead. The Indus Delta is dead, dead, dead. You've lost 12.7 square kilometers per year. Much of the delta is basically gone, and millions of people have migrated off of the delta to Karachi and other areas in further upstream. So this is another thing that really got my interest, because part of IGBP was our interest in migration. And looking at that, this is the first time we've left a delta, because I had already been giving talks like this showing that we are generating with our population 1 million person city once a week. Every week for the next 100 years, we're going to have a new 1 million person city. You look at this, where are they going? They were going onto these deltas. They're very flat. From 1975 to 2010, these 12 cities have turned into megacities, which is now being defined at 10 million. In the 1950s, it was only 5 million. Huge migration. The largest migration on Earth was onto deltas. Now Indus is telling me and other people with what's going on in the Mississippi and else is that the deltas are disappearing. We're going to have the largest migration off of the deltas. And, you know, people worried about Syria and their few million people. We've got over 500 million people on these deltas. You know, and if you're in the fight and flight world, which is where a lot of people are when it comes to things that are coming their way, you're either going to fight the thing coming or you're going to get out of the way. You have various approaches. In Vietnam and Amazon, they're learning to adapt to a water world and live on the water. In the US, we're putting houses on stilts. And in Germany, I like that version. They have their own approach. We paid attention to what the Supreme Court of Pakistan said about this flood, because it was such an enormous disaster. So if I can put my glasses on. They said most embankments were not maintained. The Tory Bund suffered years of neglected maintenance. Its height had eroded substantially long before the flood season. Last-minute misdirected departmental attempt to remove earth from its crest to fill in some other thing was not a good idea. So now I'm going to tell you what was never in the Supreme Court documents that makes, I think, what you said so interesting, because details are everything. And even as the best social scientists, governance people, natural scientists, you won't always get those details. In this particular case, as the flood was progressing down and the people of sin were saying, oh, this is really bad, help, do something, they wanted to open up that spillway. Now, here's the side story. That would have meant that one of the ministers in Pakistan who had land and an orchard, that orchard would have been flooded. They had their own armed troops that were standing to protect the land of this minister, and so the national troops were at odds. There was a bit of a conflict going on there. And because that was not resolved, 10 million people got displaced. It's very sad. So I've got two parts of this talk, and I just wanted to say at the end of here is that this is not rocket science. We're engineering our systems. To engineer a system, and let's pick a number out of the air. Maybe this system, the engineered system, costs, I don't know what, $100 billion. It's multiples of $100 billion to maintain that system. That's part of the problem, is that we build these things, but we don't have the money to keep them up. We must figure that out. So it's one thing to say, well, we're going to do all this good, which is basically to irrigate a desert, if you think that's a good idea, which is what Pakistan has done. So their food production's way up. They're very self-sufficient now, one of the better agricultural systems of the world, but it's not very capable of dealing with these natural disasters. I want to deal with this avulsion on the deltas, because this is another story that really needs to be told to you as a community of system scientists, system science, is that we used to have these distributary channels that would migrate across a delta. Sometimes they would split. There may be a lobe developed. But what's happened in our modern anthropogenic deltas is that we want to protect the infrastructure outside of the riverbanks. So we build these super riverbanks, stop banks. That keeps the water shooting across the deltas. So the deltas don't flood anymore, and they don't get sediment anymore. And because of that, the sediment that is either captured in the channel or at the river mouth, but along the way, we're sinking the deltas. So here's an example, 50 million people on the Nile. It used to have channels that would move about. Maps over the time have shown that their motion. This was not good if you lived on the delta and you couldn't run away from these floods. And so to protect all these folks, you now reduce the number of channels and you fix them in space, and you've got an engineered system. You've all heard about sea level rise due to climate warming. That's called eustasy in this diagram. Basically, you're warming up the ocean surface, you're adding water volume from ice sheets and other sources, and you get an expansion of the ocean volume. That raises sea level. If you're living on a delta, that's only one part of the story. You could be sinking that land. You could be sinking it naturally. You could be sinking it through human-induced subsidence, and I'll talk about that. And the deltas would get sediment that would keep up with sea level to some extent, but now we don't allow the sediment to get there. That's called aggradation. So part of if you looked at these satellite images of the Mekong in the upper part, or the Irrawaddy, Burma or Myanmar in the bottom, you will see that floods happen on a regular basis. In the Mekong one, it floods every year, brings sediment, adds to the land surface. In Myanmar, that's hurricane that produced a storm surge that brought a lot of sediment to the land. That's natural ways of getting aggradation. But what happens is that if you looked at the rate of aggradation today compared to where it used to be, they're all falling below the 1-to-1 line. And that's because we build one large dam on Earth every day for the last 130 years. Every day, another large dam. So the sediment is not getting out to the coastal zone anymore. Even if you didn't have dams that were trapping sediment in reservoirs, just sea level rise due to climate change, there's this recent study that most of the deltas would not have the sediment to keep up with sea level rise. That gets back to this migration thing. Because if you looked at sea level, coastal elevation over time, you know, for the 20th century, our sea level rise was 1.8 millimeters per year. All of these deltas trends that you see are so much faster than that. Jakarta, just 35 years ago. Since then, it's sunk in places 4 meters. That's more than twice my height. Pumping water. Beside it is Bangkok. Remember sea level rise, 1.8 millimeters per year. Now it's around 3.1 millimeters per year with more climate change. These cities are sinking at like 100 millimeters per year. Here's an example in Italy. They were pumping methane, sinking at 60 millimeters per year. Venice was really upset, so they stopped that nonsense. It started to recover a few years later, and now the ambient subsidence is only about 4 millimeters per year, which is more or less typical of a delta. So what are these countries doing? Well, the Netherlands lives as this nation state that's living in part on a major delta system. They spent a lot of money, 140 million a year. They're adding 30 million tons of sediment that used to come from a river. Now they're trucking it in or blowing it in. China's working on different ways and opening up the dam so that the sediment can be released and maybe get some growth going, in this case on the Yellow River. It's now growing with this new technique. In the Mississippi, there are some ideas on, we can save it. I don't think so, but this is what some scientists think. And, you know, this is how they might engineer a solution. But I'm going to go back to this movie. This area here is already receiving 70% of the sediment load, and the delta is just sinking before your eyes. So I don't think you can save the Mississippi. You certainly can figure out what can be saved and what should be just left to be given up to nature again. You see those telephone lines in the water? That used to be a road in the Chao Phraya, that now the road is underwater because it's just disappearing. So I'm going to leave you. This is my last slide, I believe, is that on this Delta story, this is one that just is not glamorous. You know, climate change is a little bit glamorous because everyone, you know, knows something about air conditioning or heating, and therefore they have a very visceral way of relating to climate. But I love the concept of the Anthropocene because it basically is talking about the human footprint, and our human footprint should definitely include climate change, but there are other ways that we are dealing with our Earth system that we have to pay attention to and very much impact what we are doing. And so that you might look at these and say, well, we can worry about engineering solutions here. We might have to abandon systems there. We might, I don't know, try to work out what can be saved. But no matter how we do this, and this is only one of the many areas of our environments that we need a more holistic way of an approach, I encourage you to put your great system science to something like this. So thank you very much.
Thank you. James, I want to thank you first. I was not disappointed coming from the television. It was a little thank you from Vienna.
Oh, thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Namaste.
And I open the floor to questions, comments.
Yes, I found your analysis extremely well thought through. But the question I want to raise is that the Indus system was in fact developed in 1909. It was the largest irrigation system ever developed in the world. This was way back in the time of the British.
Before the separation.
The British Raj before separation. Do you think there's a connection between the failure of that system because of its age, or do you think it is simply neglect?
Well, most of what the British did at that time was in the Punjab, not in the Sikh province where some of these things. So those are more modern systems, and they really do come up to engineering standards. But you can have, this is the same thing that happened with the flooding of New Orleans during the Katrina, is that much of the system was constructed to engineering standards of the day, even in New Orleans, except you had just a small percentage of them that were not. Things did not happen appropriately. Things weren't connected completely. Things were not put down in the ground as deep as they should have been. Those are the ones that failed. And so you will always have the hidden engineering failures in an otherwise good system. And I think that's also what's happened here, is that you have parts of the system that are really well engineered. And those parts are not the ones that are failing. But you're not putting money away from where people are living. And the engineering structures, if you really want to keep that water off the landscape, if that's the design, you have to make sure that that engineering system is maintained all the way up and down the 1,000 kilometers that's there, and it's not being done. The second part of this is that the people who built these engineering structures built it as if there will never be a failure. And you should always build failure potential into your engineering structures. And so putting in spillways to alleviate water height at an appropriate time if the flood wave is too fast, rising too fast, is the way that many places do this in Europe and the US, particularly on the Mississippi. That would mean that in the case of when we've opened up the spillways in the US, we send a notice out to the people who own property. Well, they don't really own it. They lease property on the spillways. And we say, you have X number of hours or days to move, get off. You've lived there knowing that this warning would come. The warning is now. We're opening up the spillway at 10 a.m., whenever. So what happens is that you would have to build that in, and you would really have to get buy-in from the people, because when those spillways open, everything in its pathway will also get wiped out. So I think that whether that kind of approach would work in every culture I don't have that knowledge. Maybe in some cultures, there will always be people that would say, I live here, I'm not going to move, in which case having a spillway isn't much better than not having a spillway. So I think a lot of thought needs to go into the safety valves that are in engineering systems. We live in an engineering system where I just want to take a moment and say that there was a study I did in the late 1990s with a French colleague. We were looking at data from pristine rivers. And so we wanted to find rivers that never had been touched by humans, and we wanted to collect that data to see whether it was different from modern values from other river systems. And it was so hard for us to get any rivers that were pristine. We almost gave up. And of course, you can go find river systems in the high Arctic, but their climate system's so different from the temperate, semi-tropical, tropical regions that, what's the point? So we live in an engineering world. We should admit it. This is the world we live in today. Let's deal with what we have today.
One short remark, you said it was engineering great, but then you have the operator failure. The best thing is if he opens the door in the wrong way. So there are two ways. It's also in engineering, but...
Yeah, I happen to know that dam operator. I met her at a meeting. And when you have a reservoir, a dam, basically a dam operates like a bank. You have money coming in, money going out. And when you throw that money out to generate hydroelectric power or irrigation or whatever you're using the water for, you want to make sure that you have enough money in the bank for when you might need it later. And so they try to maintain optimal levels in a dam. The worst thing that can happen is if you have too much water in this case in Thailand, you had a big monsoonal system coming in, dumped a lot of water. The dam operator says, if I don't do something now, I will get an overtopping. If you get an overtopping, it's basically a wipe the whole dam out, in which case you will have the world's worst natural disaster. So they then release the water. How fast you release it is all guesswork. No dam operator knows that. So the best way to deal with it is to release too much, right? Because you want to keep the dam structure somewhat safe. There's the world we live in where people are making these decisions all the time. And as I'm not a religious person, but God bless them, because, I don't know how they do this. It's a big responsibility.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether my question is going to contradict your perspective, but I'm Ray Ison. I'm Professor of Systems at the Open University in the UK. We've been working in water governance and social learning approaches in water and river governance for the best part of 20 years in the Netherlands, Europe in particular, and other parts of the world. I'd like to say that in the Netherlands, there is a culture evolved where engineers work collaboratively with society to manage and co-manage their circumstances, and therefore there's a lot of trust between engineers, scientists, and society, which is fundamentally different than most other contexts. In the UK, which has piddly little rivers, I admit, I'd like to give you an example of what I call framing failure around crises. In one set of circumstances in the Mersey, a minister was being shown the disaster that was unfolding, and he had the presence to recognise that this was not a problem of the river, but a problem of the society that surrounded the river, and thus framed it as a social problem rather than a biophysical problem, and led to the Mersey campaign, which has been exceptionally successful. Come to recent times, Somerset Levels, framed narrowly by vested interests as an engineering failure to drain properly, and you exacerbate the disaster rather than helping. And so what I'd like to suggest is, are we, or the question I guess is in my statement is, are we not acting ethically and responsibly when we don't draw attention to framings of these situations? And are we also not acting ethically when we don't involve local people in the processes of coping with these?
Part of my job when I was chair of IGBP, it's now folded into, as you heard earlier, into Future Earth, was to meet with governments from around the world. Our trips, I'd get to about 20 countries a year. They were always sponsored by the national academies. We would meet with the various ministers and secretaries. We would meet with the aid agencies in their countries. And we would try to find out the lay of the land. And the one thing I've learned from all of that is that ways of doing things in one country don't really translate that well to another country. They don't think like you might think. Their approaches are different. If you were trying to say, I've got a solution to your problem, you likely do not. And so, how much you can translate information, what you can do is you can provide warning. You could say, our climate model is saying that you're going to have a weather system approach that could be disastrous. It may not be, but it could be. Fair warning. Here's the magnitude that it could be. So that's typical hurricane warning. We could do that. And the other country can choose to either react or not react. If you were to say to them, well, we see that there's this weather system coming, and you've got all these dams that are now too full to capacity, because we can see the dam levels from space. And we could provide, and we do provide this information, because a lot of the countries hide this information from one another, because water has always been a threat of security from one country to another country. Upstream dammers like China really are impacting downstream countries like Vietnam, as an example. So we provide a sort of a level playing field. We get this information out. Do we get it to the right people? Let's say we get it to the dam operators. We don't know if the dam operators will make use of this information. We don't know if the member countries are going to scare their population that there could be a flood, but there might not be. You know, in Taiwan, they do watermelons on the river systems. And so when one of these flash floods comes down from a typhoon that hits them, cyclone, you know, they've got like about half an hour to get their equipment off the river systems and leave whatever they're going to have to leave. So that's a countries that used to very fast reaction. In Britain, are they faster reaction? Because they don't have those kind of flashy experiences that Taiwan gets like 10 times a year. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that this is really complicated. You have to say, well, where is the disaster going to be unfolding? And then what's behind that country? And what systems are in place? And you might have to do things that scientists don't want to do, which is to say, it's not my business, but I got to tell somebody. At least I'm going to tell, if I'm an American, I'm going to tell the American embassy in Pakistan that something big was happening. I'll tell you another story about this. This is just remarkable. There were people in Pakistan that actually wanted one of the air bases that was an American air base to flood because of the role the U.S. played in the early part of the Afghan war. So there were people saying, no, let's break the dam here. So, I mean, as this was unfolding, I mean, politics, the way we make decisions, everything was up in the air. That's why I do think that what you said, this was a wicked system, a wicked, complex system that we shouldn't hold ourselves very high. We can provide basic information, and hopefully that basic information can help.
I think we finished our time. I want again to thank you. Want to thank also the distant speaker, Roberto Poli, and I think we had quite an interesting and I'm hopeful to take something home lecture like that. Thank you, and have a good lunch now.